Alright, hey class, this is Miss Smith. Lecture number 2 is mainly about how different bone types develop and grow and form. So we covered this before, Lab 2.2. There are different types of bone cells we'll be talking about. There are osteoblasts, osteoclasts, and osteocytes, which you already know about since those are the ones that are found within the lacunae of Haversian systems in compact bone. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how bones are formed. There are two different ways bones are formed, and if you read page 188 through 192, there's also a summary of how that happens in table 7.1. Notice this is table, not figure 7.1. You'll find that there are actually two different ways that bone can form, and it will actually depend on what kind of bone is being developed here. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the intramembranous style of bone formation first, and I'm going to do that by drawing. Alright, so some sucker left a huge box of crayons for me to play with, so I guess I'll be using crayons today to draw on this. If you want, you can just watch me draw and explain first, and then draw it down yourself, or if you want, you could draw while I'm explaining it. You could do it on a piece of scratch paper or on the back of your notes for lecture number 2. So first of all, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the intramembranous ossification style. The word ossification means to form bone, and intramembranous ossification will develop only certain types of bone, and the example is they will only produce skull bone. Your clavicle bone is your collarbone, and you will also get the mandible, which is your jawbone. And the way intramembranous ossification works, it's kind of complicated, but it starts in the skull of a fetus, a fairly young fetus, earlier than 8 weeks. And what's going to happen is in the skull area of the fetus, you are going to get some stem cells, and these stem cells are going to form some connective tissue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab one of these pretty colors here. I've got wisteria. Ooh. So I'm going to draw some stem cells, and I'm just going to draw a couple here. And what's going to happen is the stem cells are going to form, and they're going to aggregate around any area that has blood vessels available. And I mean, I guess that makes sense because you want to have a nutrient supply. I'm going to grab a red here to draw a blood vessel. And there might be a blood vessel over here as well, and here. And so what's going to happen is they're going to start making copies and dividing, and they'll divide mostly around your blood vessels. And at some point, what's going to happen is these stem cells will be stimulated to differentiate. A stem cell is a cell that has no real job or purpose until they are stimulated to develop into a different type of cell. So these stem cells are going to form connective tissue, and when these connective tissue cells are stimulated again, they will turn into your osteoblasts. So I'm going to pick a darker purple color, and so this cell is now going to turn into an osteoblast. So we're going to change its color, and then this cell will be developed into an osteoblast. In reality, I probably should have drawn these cells closer. And what the osteoblasts are going to do now, their new job is to start depositing bone matrix. So I'm going to use a lighter color again, and I'm going to be using Marvelous to show you these osteoblasts right here. They'll start making bone matrix, and if you remember what bone matrix is, it is what osteocytes make, and they're going to make it out of calcium phosphate, some salts, and your organic matter. Collagen, that tough protein. And when you have an osteoblast and it makes enough matrix to completely cover itself. So for example, here you have an osteoblast and it's not covered in bone matrix yet, then it's still considered an osteoblast. But as soon as it's covered in bone matrix, then it is known as an osteocyte. And then from there on out, its main job is to make bone matrix, more bone matrix. And this should look familiar. And the reason why this should look familiar is because if you've taken the oral quiz already, I might have shown you this image here. If you haven't taken it yet, don't worry. If I showed you this image here, we discussed that this was spongy bone, and the spongy bone is made up of these spicules of bone matrix called trabeculae. And if you zoom in on the trabeculae, you'll see these individual little dots that are hanging out there, and those little dots are actually osteocytes, which would be these cells that we just drew, which means this bone matrix now is forming a trabecula. And if you zoom in on this image even farther, you'll get this type of magnification. And what you're looking at here is this is all bone matrix. And this bone matrix has a couple of cells embedded within it, and those are going to be your osteocytes. Notice the cells that are not embedded on the inside of the trabeculae are your osteoblasts. There is another type of cell that is mentioned in this specific image called an osteoclast. According to that PowerPoint, an osteoclast is a cell that destroys bone. And you're probably thinking, why would we want a cell that destroys this bone that we have here that keeps us nice and strong? Well, osteoclasts do have to break up bone in areas where you're not using it as much, because when you break up that bone, you can reuse that material and put it somewhere you might actually be using it. So I'm actually showing you guys this book right here. If you're interested in borrowing it or checking it out during class, let me know. So let's go ahead and get back to this image. So now we have a trabecula with osteocytes that are covered in bone matrix here. Some of the cells that haven't turned into osteocytes yet, they're still hanging out on the outside and haven't been covered in matrix. These are still osteoblasts, and they're going to start forming, you're going to have some connective tissue that starts forming the periosteum on the outside. Remember, periosteum is the soft tissue that actually attaches to the blood vessels as well. So here's a periosteum layer. And the osteoblasts that are right underneath the periosteum, what they're going to do is they're going to start depositing more bone matrix, and this time though, when they make more bone matrix and when they make more copies of themselves, they're going to do so in a much more organized fashion. So they're going to make copies, and they're going to make their copies in circular patterns. And the reason why they're doing so in a much more organized fashion is because they're actually forming haversian canals, or haversian systems, sorry. This would be a super zoomed in. So it's not really to scale. I mean, these haversian systems should have been way smaller. Sorry about that. Or sorry, way larger. I didn't leave myself enough space. But these osteoblasts are going to start forming compact bone on the sides here. And that's how you can classify flat bones that have been made via intramembranous ossification. If you have a layer of compact bone, a layer of spongy bone, and then a layer of compact bone, that's typical of intramembranous bones. All right, so then let's go ahead and talk about the other type of ossification, which is called endochondral ossification. I'm going to switch that paper over. So the other type we have is endochondral ossification. And this is the type of ossification that forms pretty much all other bones. You can think of it as all the bones beneath your skull, well, with the exception of your collarbone. So the way endochondral ossification works is your body first develops cartilage. So your body is going to develop thick cartilage pieces, and the cartilage tissue is actually going to have some stem cells in there as well. The cartilage tissue is actually going to start breaking down, and while it's breaking down, a periosteum is developing around it. So I'm just going to take a darker color. I'm going to draw or shade in a periosteum layer here. And some of the cells on the inside are actually going to start breaking down the cartilage. And while the cartilage is breaking down, in the center area, you have something known as a primary ossification center. And this is where endochondral ossification begins first. So this is the primary . And in the center, you again have some stem cells, cells that have no job yet, and they're going to be stimulated to start breaking down this cartilage layer. While they're doing that, they're also differentiating, and they're getting a job, and they are turning into osteoblasts again. And what the osteoblasts are going to do is they're actually going to move towards the outside, or along the where we would see a diaphysis. And so they're going to start forming here. And this is known as a bone collar. Kind of looks like a collar. And they start forming there first as the cartilage starts breaking away. And this would be a good place to start forming because the diaphysis needs to be the strongest portion of the bone. And what's going to happen is as they keep forming, the osteoblasts do the same thing where they start making their bone matrix. And when they do make bone matrix, once they become totally encased in the bone matrix, then they're known as osteocytes. Of course, they keep making copies and more copies. And around a few years, between birth and about 5 years old, you're actually going to notice a secondary ossification center. And that area is actually going to occur in what we know as the epiphysis area. And the second ossification center, they're going to start forming around these areas. And they're going to have osteoblasts that start making cells inward. I'm actually going to use a different color here. Let's see, what color can I use? So these secondary osteoblasts are going to start forming their osteocytes, and they start moving inward here, while the osteoblasts from the primary ossification site, they keep moving outward, and where they meet, that's known as our epiphyseal line or epiphyseal plate. So where the primary osteoblasts meet and the secondary osteoblasts meet, that's going to be our line. And that growth plate is actually made up of different layers of cells. So, sorry, let's finish up with this actually. These cells keep growing. The osteoblasts make a more compact layer towards the outer sides here, and the cartilage continues to break down. If we zoom in on the epiphyseal plate here, what you're going to notice is the epiphyseal plate is actually made up of 4 layers of cell. Alright, so the epiphyseal plate is made up of 4 layers. So we zoomed in on the 4 layers here. I wanted to draw it first just to make sure I had the colors right. The layer closest to the epiphysis end is called layer number 1. And layer number 2, the one a little bit closer to the diaphysis, layer 2 is an important one because layer 2 are where you have mitotic cells, cells that actually make copies of themselves. And as they make copies of themselves, they're going to add some of the newer copies to layer number 1. Most of layer number 1 is actually just cells that are resting, and they make up the epiphysis, and that's where you're going to have bone marrow in between. The older layer 2 cells, they get pushed towards the diaphysis. And layer 3, mostly older cells, they're starting to die off. And then layer 4 is getting as close to the diaphysis as you possibly can. And these cells are mostly all dead, and they're nice and calcified. Remember, calcified means hardened, essentially. So they get added to the epiphyseal line here. And so as these cells make copies of themselves, that means they're pushing out more and more, and that's how your bones grow longer and longer. And that's why the epiphyseal line is also known as the growth plate. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the PowerPoint now. So here what you're looking at is a fetus, and the fetus, you'll notice, has some bone formation already. The bones forming in the head area is the intramembranous bones, and remember it's skull, collarbone, and mandible that gets formed this way. And then you have endochondral bones forming in the rest of the skeleton. So as soon as the egg is fertilized by the sperm cell, bone will start developing after 8 weeks, and your bone will continue to grow until about 23, 24, 25 years old, in which case the growth plate will be completely calcified and there's no more mitotic cells in that second layer, so you will not grow anymore. This is a better drawing, I guess, of what I was trying to show for the endochondral ossification. Notice what you have here is your cartilage, and as the cartilage keeps breaking away, more and more bone is formed to take its place. And all you're left with is the articular cartilage at the ends. So your bones actually perform homeostasis in the way that it can make adjustments based on usage. For example, if you start using one bone more than the other, then the osteoclast can start breaking down bones in the less used area, reabsorbing the nutrients, and then the osteoblasts can start using those nutrients in order to make bone in an area that is used more often. Your bone is made up of more than just collagen and calcium phosphate. It's also going to need some vitamin D, vitamin A, and C. And the reason why we need vitamin D, it's actually not for building bone, but if we didn't have vitamin D, our body wouldn't be able to absorb calcium very well. And that's why people say that you should either intake a lot of vitamin D or you can go outside and get some sun because sunlight actually triggers our cells to make vitamin D and that will help us absorb the calcium that we eat. Vitamin A and C are also useful in the process of forming bones. Vitamin C is needed for actual collagen. Growth hormone is what triggers cartilage to cells to reproduce to make cartilage, and it's secreted by a gland known as the pituitary gland. And then you have thyroid hormone, which will actually get the cartilage replaced during endochondral ossification. However, if you have too much of certain hormones, it can actually cause ossification to happen way too quickly, and that will cause growth stunts. So what is bone good for? I mean, these are pretty basic common sense things. It gives you a lot of shape. There's a lot of empty cavities that are formed because of the bone you have in your body. It allows for protection, such as it protects your skull. You have movement, and inside of bone you have bone marrow, and bone marrow makes blood cells, and this is a process known as hematopoiesis. And bone is actually going to store two types of bone marrow. There's red bone marrow and yellow bone marrow. You have also, this is where your body stores a lot of salts and other minerals that you might need for other cells later on. So here are the two types of bone marrows, red and yellow. Red is found in the epiphyseal ends of the bones, and they form red blood cells and white blood cells, the one that fight infections, and they also form platelets, which is a main component of blood actually. Yellow bone marrow you'll find in the diaphysis, and yellow marrow actually stores fat, and it's not very active in blood cell formation. However, at some point in time, yellow marrow does become red marrow, and you'll find that in the diaphysis.